Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Brahinsky. I'm with the Santa Cruz Neighborhood Organizing Circle and wanted to welcome you all. And thank you for coming. We are a community organizing group. We usually go door to door, listening to people and talking with them about the issues that they care about and helping them to organize around that. And we can't do that right now. So what we are doing is a lot of people are talking and thinking about how to do policing and how to do policing differently. And so we helped organize this panel to have that conversation. Hope you enjoy.
Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Camila Hawthorne. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz. And I'm very, very excited about this panel. So first, I'd like to start by thanking Josh Brahinsky and the Santa Cruz Organizing Circle for putting together this event, and to everyone who helped us spread the word. And I also want to extend a huge thank you to our fantastic panelists. We realize that in this moment of global Black liberation uprisings, the people who have been doing research and organizing around policing for years or decades even, have been really overtaxed, and they've been called upon to speak at countless events and share their wisdom with audiences around the world. So we're especially grateful that you have come here today to share your precious time and labor with us. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. Dr. Nikki Jones is a professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley who researches the experiences of Black women, men, and youth with the criminal justice system and policing. Dr. Jones is the author of Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence, published in 2010, and The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption, from June 2018. Ben Adam Clymer is an EMT and a crisis counselor and consultant with Cahoots, Eugene's alternative to police dispatch. And Kayla Kumar is commissioner on the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Commission of Santa Cruz County, a board member of Salud para la Gente, and a proponent of restorative justice with experience ranging from state prisons, local juvenile halls, and probation centers. She is currently the development director of FoodWhat, supporting the well-being and liberation of marginalized youth. So we're all here today to learn and think together about the urgent questions of policing, violence, and racism facing our community and the nation today. Many of us have found ourselves for the first time thrust into intense debates about police defunding, abolition, reform, the prison industrial complex, and much more. I imagine that you've come here today with many questions, as well as a curiosity that emerges from a shared desire to see positive transformations in our community. So I look forward to this collective process of learning how we can together reimagine Santa Cruz and the country as a whole as a place that is truly just and safe for all. And if you are feeling even more inspired by today's panel, there are a number of ways to get involved locally. The Black community in Santa Cruz meets regularly to discuss issues around policing here. There is a Defund SCPD coalition that has a number of exciting upcoming events planned. And there is also a group for people of color in the Santa Cruz area focused on police defunding, out of which has also emerged a reading group for POC on abolition. And that just scratches the surface of all of the exciting new and ongoing spaces of organizing in our community. So if you're interested in learning more about these, you can email me at camila.hawthorne@gmail.com, or you can contact the Santa Cruz Organizing Circle at scorganizingcircle@gmail.com. A few words about how this event is organized. This Zoom call is a webinar, which means that you will only be able to see and hear the panelists, not the rest of the audience. We ask that you only use the chat for logistical issues. For instance, if you are unable to hear or see a presentation. You can type questions into the question and answer box, and I will then ask them to the panelists. So each presenter will speak for approximately 15 minutes, and then we will have about 30 minutes for a Q&A discussion. So let's get started. Our first speaker today is Dr. Nikki Jones.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me, Professor Hawthorne. Thank you for that introduction. Josh, thank you for the invitation. And to my fellow panelists, it's an honor, pleasure to be on the panel with you, and I look forward to learning from you as well. And to those folks listening in, I really look forward to the conversation that we'll be having after each of us takes some time to present. And so I'm just going to present some initial thoughts that I'm having in this moment on defunding, what it means and what comes next, what's already coming next. In the hopes of providing this introduction, we'll provide some kind of shared foundation for the conversation to follow. So I'll provide just a really brief introduction of who I am and how I enter into this work, what defunding means, how I understand defunding, how I understand the demands of abolitionists, police abolitionists in particular, and then what comes after defunding, because I think that's one of the things that we're all very interested in. And so after this moment, we actually know that before this moment, during this moment, and after this moment is the project of rebuilding. And so what does that look like on the ground right now? And then some next steps, particularly for folks in Santa Cruz. One of the things that I've shared with folks recently is that defunding is a national movement, but it's a local process. And so what does that mean for folks in Santa Cruz? Okay, so how do I enter into this work? I think it's really important for us to think about how each of us enters into the work. I'm a professor of African American Studies. My work is rooted in the Black intellectual tradition. We could think of some models of the Black intellectual tradition, like W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, whose work is quite relevant in this moment. And when I think about what makes up the Black intellectual tradition, I go back to the work of the late Manning Marable, historian who spent most of his career at Columbia University. And he writes in an article, Black Studies in the Racial Mountain, which is a riff on Langston Hughes, the Black artist in the Racial Mountain, that Black Studies is defined by three characteristics. It's descriptive, it's corrective, and it's prescriptive. And so it's descriptive in that it describes Black life from the center of Black life. It values the subjectivity of Black life. It does not look at Black people as a problem. It asks the questions, what problems do Black people face and how do they go about reconciling those problems? It's corrective. It pushes back against theories of inferiority, biological, psychological, cultural, and we know these theories are in circulation as much now as the time when Du Bois and Wells were writing. And it's prescriptive. It is intended to tell us something about the world and direct us right on a path of transformation. And that includes transformation of society and a challenge and transformation of society based on white supremacy, rooted in white supremacy. So that's how I enter into this work. And certainly my work is also rooted in Black feminist epistemology. Thinking about the work of Patricia Hill Collins especially has been really impactful on the work that I've done. And this work, you have the value of lived experience, right? You have an understanding that knowledge is produced in dialogue with others. So the kinds of conversations that the Santa Cruz neighborhood organizing group is happening on front steps around the neighborhood, those are important conversations. That's when knowledge is being produced. An ethic of caring, right? Emotion matters. And certainly when we're talking about defunding and defunding police, emotions come in to play, and I would say rightfully so, rightfully so. And Black feminist epistemology does not privilege objectivity, right? Numbers, statistics over emotion. And really it's the engagement, the back and forth between the two where knowledge is produced. And then an ethic of personal responsibility. To whom am I accountable? And that question is especially important when we think about the question of defunding. And so you see each of these kind of orienting paradigms reflected in my work. Professor Hawthorne mentioned the two books that I published, Between Good and Ghetto, and The Chosen Ones. Between Good and Ghetto is based in tough neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and The Chosen Ones is based in San Francisco. On the right there is a photo that I took while I was doing field work in San Francisco, and something I came to describe as a standoff between the police and young people in the neighborhood who had just witnessed one of their peers being thrown in the back of a police car. And this incident didn't go viral in any way. It was a routine kind of encounter in the neighborhood. And I've learned a lot from the research that I've done from the perspective that's shown in the photograph, from the side of young people who are coming of age in neighborhoods that are routinely policed in both aggressive and intrusive ways. I've also done some work on the other side of what I describe as the dividing line, analyzing video recordings of police encounters, both taken in high surveillance neighborhoods and taken from the perspective during ride-alongs with law enforcement and from dash cam videos as well. And from that perspective, I've come to understand, along with my research team, the ways that racism makes its way into the interactional and linguistic infrastructure of policing in a way that makes the kinds of reforms that are often proposed very difficult to imagine as solutions to the problems that folks are articulating in protests around the country, protests against police violence and protests against structural racism. And so all of that informs where I am now when it comes to thinking about defunding. And I share this piece from California Magazine because in that Q&A, in the Q&A, I make the point of highlighting my own evolution on the question of police abolition. Now, I thought of myself as an abolitionist from the time I started doing work in graduate school, inspired by folks like Angela Davis, by Beth Ritchie, later Ruth Wilson Gilmore, think of the work of Joy James. But I didn't think of myself as a police abolitionist, which just goes to show that I wasn't a very good abolitionist, right? Because abolitionists understand that policing is part of a larger carceral system. And in the work that I've done, in the research that I've done over the last 10 years, in the work that I've done, in the conversations I've been immersed in the Department of African American Studies at Berkeley, for sure, I've come to a deeper understanding of that and have a clear understanding of the limits of reform. And all of that informs why it may seem that I have such confidence and conviction when it comes to support for defunding. But I also say that to open space for people to come into the conversation, to enter into the conversation, right? To not be afraid by the word defunding, right? But to think about the conversations that happen after one utters that word, and to be open to evolving yourselves as well. So just briefly, so what does defunding mean? What does it mean to me? Now, certainly there are folks who say defund the police. It means take the money, all the money now, right? And also we can understand defunding as a part of a larger abolitionist effort to reduce the scope, scale, power, legitimacy of criminalizing institutions, of law enforcement, and especially important, right, as a project of building up simultaneously what Ruth Wilson Gilmore has described as life-sustaining and life-affirming institutions that better address the problems that we've asked, people have called on the police to respond to, particularly over the last 50 years. There's also a moral dimension, right, to the conversation around defunding, identifies that there's a moral dimension to budgeting, that we should be putting our resources where our values are. And certainly to fund from these values, from a higher set of values, and not from fear. And so when we think about what police abolition means, as I said just a moment ago, it understands that policing is part of a larger carceral system, a larger system of racially targeted anti-Black policing, containment, surveillance, punishment. It's all part of that system. So you can't, in fact, be against mass incarceration and not take the conversation on defunding and police abolition seriously. The conversation around police abolition challenges taking for granted assumptions about who ensures safety, who delivers safety, and it advocates a process of reallocating resources away from the police and toward community-based models of safety, support, and prevention. And again, as I said just a moment ago, it's about building up these life-affirming institutions and investing in non-criminalizing resources that ensure care instead of delivering harm. And that is, I think, for me, one of the most exciting parts about this conversation in this moment, right? This opportunity to think about what has to be here now in order to build up these life-affirming institutions. And so for folks who are just entering into this conversation, I would encourage you to take a look at the piece that the New York Times Magazine did on Ruth Wilson Gilmore a couple of years ago. So I think it's a really nice entry for folks who are kind of confused about, or just unsure, right, about what abolition means. And certainly this idea of abolition is rooted, again, in the Black intellectual tradition, in abolition democracy. This is a conversation that we are having in our department right now. My colleague, brilliant colleague, Lee Rayford, has used this as a way to kind of unite some of the projects in our department and to think about the conversations that need to be had in order to actually address the failing of emancipation, the failing of freedom. We go back to Du Bois's work in Black Reconstruction. He makes the point that freedom was not delivered because the institutions that actually guarantee freedom, not just limit freedom, right? So we can get rid of slavery, we can abolish slavery, but if we don't have the presence, and Angela Davis builds on this in her work in Abolition Democracy, if we don't have the presence of those social institutions that can actually guarantee racial equality, that can guarantee freedom, then it's not full freedom. And really, that is the project that we are still involved in, and that's the project that Abolitionist Calls to Defund has encouraged us to return to. And so what about reform? And so I'm sure that there are some folks on the call, I get this question all the time when I'm teaching classes, you know, Professor Jones, you know, what do we do in the meantime, right? There are police departments now, what are we supposed to do? And I always return, I should say often return to the work of Paul Butler, who's a legal scholar at Georgetown University, who wrote an article on the limits of criminal justice reform. And he makes the point that we could think of reforms as ratchets. And I spent a lot of time in my father's toolbox when I was a kid, so I know what a ratchet is. Some folks may not know what a ratchet is, so I include a picture of it there for you, but it's just a tool that you can get a nut and bolt there and kind of weaken it, right? Or tighten it, right? But it's one kind of, one point, one site in the system. And sometimes that's really important. Sometimes if you don't make an adjustment, it can risk the lives of people. It can make people more vulnerable. And we've seen some of that in the research. But the point that Butler makes is that we can't confuse ratchets with fundamental transformation. We can't think that reforms, particularly the kinds of reformist reforms that abolitionists identify that actually just make the system operate in a more efficient way and seemingly less violent way, but still more efficient way. We can't imagine, we can't be confused about the idea that those kinds of reforms will actually ever lead to fundamental transformation, right? Instead, we need to be thinking about those non-reformist reforms that actually limit the power of the institution. And I do think that the ban on predictive technology is that kind of non-reformist reform. It limits the expansion, limits the flow of funding into policing, and just challenges the legitimacy and the monopoly that policing has on the question and the problem, imagined problem of crime. And so what comes next, what's coming next? And if someone wants to hold up, I don't know if anyone's doing time, but if I'm getting overtime, just let me know and I can be more concise. And so if we think about, what's already happened, one of the things that is striking about this present moment, and especially the last 5 years, when we think about police abolition, it has happened at lightning speed. The conversation has moved forward at lightning speed when compared to for example, to mass incarceration. And so we've seen reforms over the last few years, and we've seen a lot of work that set us up for this moment, that set cities up for this moment. So we've seen, cities like Minneapolis sever institutions, sever contracts with local police departments. Again, we've heard about their effort to dismantle the police department, a plan to dismantle the police department and build up a different system of safety here in Oakland. We've seen a vote in favor of getting police out of schools, and this is something that we've seen in other places. And certainly there's more of a commitment and conversation now around police accountability, transparency, disciplinary records, getting to see those records than there has been in prior to this last 5 years. And we've seen, as I expect, that there is support for the actions that defunding is calling for, and less support for the slogan. And this is a poll from a month ago, and so it's changed, but I suspect that the headline won't change. The numbers will change, they'll fluctuate, but the headline, that people have a kind of visceral reaction, depending on where they're coming from, to the phrasing of defunding. And I think that has to do with a kind of sense of racial fear and their kind of de facto support for law enforcement that many middle-class folks have, and have because they haven't had negative encounters with the police. But I think it's important to focus in on this moment that there is some support. There's more support than previously for making the kinds of changes when it comes to policing and investing in other institutions and services than there has been previously. And so I'm very excited to have Ben from Cahoots because it's one of the programs that I've talked about over the last couple of months. And there's another program that I think is an example of this kind of investment in other kinds of institutional or other kinds of responses to crisis and to problems that police would typically be called on to respond to. So one example is Mental Health First, a part of the work of the Anti-Police Terror Project in Sacramento. And again, training folks to go out and to respond to crisis so that it's not armed officers who are responding to people in crisis, people in need. And that's just one example. And I include the story here in the KQED, a reference so folks can take a look if they want to. And of course, the work of Miriam Kiba is essential, right, in this moment. And I think it's important as we enter into this conversation to echo what Professor Hawthorne said, that we don't erase or the folks who have been doing this work for a very long time and at very great risk to their careers and to their standing. And so I think, the work that folks have been doing, this is important and it must be acknowledged. This is a useful site for folks who are coming into this conversation. There's a host of resources. This site existed before the current moment, right? And I suspect that, it's been added to more recently. And then this is to wrap up, there's the question that I get often is what should I do? What can I do, right? And what should I do? And I think the question of what can you do has to do with who you are, where you are, and what your influence is. I think that if you are a Black person, a Black woman, a queer Black woman in this moment, what you may have to do is rest, care for yourself, because it is a heavy moment. If that's not how you are positioned, then you might think about what it means for you to do this work, to be, as Benita Love says, a co-conspirator and not simply an ally, to put your body on the line in the ways that make sense for you in order to move this work forward. But thinking about, Santa Cruz and what I can say that might be helpful in particular for folks in Santa Cruz is to go back to what I said at the top, is that defunding is a national movement, but it's a local process. And you know more about the local landscape and the local actors and the local budgets than I do, but certainly having a sense of how all these actors are working together is essential in any kind of intervention. Having an understanding of what the key concerns are. Often I hear from law enforcement that they actually don't need to be defunded, they need more funding, they need more officers because they don't have enough officers. And I think a response to that in this moment is, well, instead of hiring more officers, why don't you ask police to do less, right? And invest in other institutions. And to think about a data plan and marshaling data in a way that's not used to simply reinforce the power of law enforcement, but is used, as Andrew Ferguson describes it, as bright data. So you should have access to data from policing, but also you should be thinking about, once those problems or concerns are illuminated, what other institutions exist that can respond to those problems, right, that aren't the police. And certainly, again, for anyone on the call who's just entering into this conversation and wants to go more deeply, I think that these resources, one of the places that I go all the time is the Movement for Black Lives, and to see what they're saying on this and what their platform is. And I think, especially in thinking about data, I would also add to think about the numbers and the budget. I would take a look at what's happening in LA around the people's budget. And so when you think about what does it actually mean to fund, the community safety, to invest in community safety, not public safety in the way that it's imagined, I think this kind of people's budget is an example of that. So I'll wrap it up there and say, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. That was really illuminating. So much wonderful information and background and historical context for our current moment. So now I will pass it over to Ben Adam from Cahoots. Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, hello. Oh, I just lost the thing. Where'd it go? Share. So I'm Ben Adam. And I am a consultant with the Cahoots program at Whitebird Clinic in Eugene, Oregon, in Springfield. I no longer work as a crisis counselor and in EMT there. I now live in Los Angeles County in Pasadena, where I'm working with cities all throughout California on trying to develop these mobile crisis programs, what I'm calling mobile crisis intervention services. That was so wonderful. I just want to really, echo just how phenomenal Dr. Jones's presentation was there. And I was listening to a different panel earlier today, from one of the LA County supervisors, Mark Ridley Thomas. They just passed a motion creating an anti-racist perspective or anti-racist motion that the county needs to be anti-racist. There's a really great panelist, I can't remember his name, Mark Anthony something, and he made this point, which is, progressive politics does not automatically mean that something is anti-racist. And so what I do want to maybe make a point before we do this, before I do this presentation on mobile crisis, is that this is definitely a progressive policy, but to truly be the anti-racist model that we truly want it to be, we have to actually be intentional about that when creating these things in cities. That we can't just rely on this idea that when we put mobile crisis maybe in place of police, that it's going to suddenly change racial dynamics in our society. So mobile crisis intervention services, or Cahoots, is what we call it up in Eugene and Springfield. It's a new model for first response, and it's a supportive service first response. It is a non-emergency first response to residents in cities or areas that are experiencing mental health, substance use, or homelessness related crises. It's very much what Dr. Jones just said, in terms of, we're creating these programs in places so that as the call comes for funding to be transferred, there is some infrastructure in place to take those responsibilities. So what does MCIS do? It's a different type of response. It alleviates the burdens placed on police and fire to manage crises that derive from emotional distress, substance use, homelessness. But it also provides de-escalation so that people don't rise to that level when they're feeling overwhelmed or distressed. They don't rise to that level that makes it an emergency, where there needs to be an immediate response and people are feeling threatened or scared. So the team on mobile crisis is made up of a crisis counselor. So there's you can see in that photo there, that's my coworker Ned and my coworker Rose, or down here my old coworker Manning and my old coworker Amy. And one is the EMT and one is a crisis intervention worker. The crisis counselor sort of does your sort of general social work intervention. They provide de-escalation, emotional validation, all conflict mediation, and all those kinds of services that you might need if you're feeling really distressed. And the EMT, they provide a couple of services, but mainly their goal is to rule out physical health issues that might be presenting with mental health issues. So, a lot of times people have blood sugars, for example, who are diabetic, and their blood sugar is down at 60, and they can be very, erratic, grumpy, sleepy. They can act sort of in ways that people think that they're having mental health issues, or they think that they're intoxicated, but actually their blood sugar is really low. And it's very simple to tell if you've got an EMT there. They can just poke their finger, and so that's what how the teams work together. You access Cahoots through anyone can do it. through the non-emergency or the 911 system. You call up and you say, you know, I need a Cahoots unit at 7th and Washington. There's a man on the northwest corner. He's screaming at traffic, but he doesn't seem to be screaming at anyone in particular. He just seems a little bit like he's having a bad day, and we can go out and check on him. The sort of primary sort of call that we do is called the wellness check, or also called the welfare check, depending on which what your city calls it. And that can be on any number of people. So sleeping in the park, people not returning phone calls, people making vague suicidal statements is a very common thing for us to go out on. People unseen by neighbors and their mail's building up, so they might be worried that they're dead inside their house, or an old elderly person who may have fallen on the floor and can't get up. And like I said, someone screaming at no one in particular on the corner. You know, they're not being dangerous to anyone. They're just doing that, and they need someone to check on them. And you know, this is a good image here, just the sort of standard Cahoots call. It's a little grainy. It's probably raining. It was Oregon. So who receives services? Everyone, anyone, every single person can receive services. We function the same way as the police or the fire department and EMS do, which is to say that we don't put restrictions, we don't put limits on who we'll go out to see. So a lot of times we are billed often as a sort of a new response to people who are living on the street. And that's really what we're primarily for. And while we do that, only about 50% of our calls are with people who are living on the street. The other 50% are with people in their houses. You know, it's not an uncommon experience for me as a Cahoots crisis counselor to be pulling somebody who's living on the street out of the mud. They might be living on the street, intoxicated, and we get them to the sobering center, and then 10 minutes later, I'll be in a 6,000 square foot home with one of the richest people in the city, talking to their teenager who's feeling depressed. That's a pretty common just swing of the sort of types of folks that we go check on and work with. Here's just a list of general people that we work with, just everywhere. So in terms of being sort of anti-racist, one of the great things about mobile crisis is it does provide good jobs for people who want to be involved in their community in sort of an exciting and meaningful way, but they don't want to join the police because of the historical trauma of that. It also doesn't rely on diagnoses, and it doesn't rely on medications. It relies on affect and body language and all that kind of stuff. And so it's available. It can function in any sort of you know, as long as you're sensitive to somebody's cultural standpoint, you can participate in that. It doesn't rely on that sort of white Western model of mental health and things of that nature. We are still fluent in that sort of language, but we are also, you know, we don't rely on that in the way that other models do. Okay. Going fast on this. Usually I do this. Usually this presentation's about a half an hour, so I'm packing it down here. So we do these are sort of common interventions that we do. I've gone over most of these already, so I won't move on that here. So our relationship with the police is that you know, we do a lot of what we call jail diversions, which is to say that if we weren't there, if Cahoots didn't exist, the person would have probably gone to jail at that time. So our intervention prevented that. So we did just right around 10 per day in 2018. In 2018, 86% of our responses did not involve the police at all. And then the other 13 did involve, well, 13 involved police, 1% involved the fire department. 13% did involve the police. The key to that, though, is that we're not calling the cops on people. That the reason that the police are on a lot of those calls is because the cops are calling us for people. So the police will be out with somebody and decide, you know, this is not a police call, let's get the crisis team out here, and then they call for us. So one of our sort of most proud activities that we do is a suicide assessments and interventions. 69% of our interventions in 2018 were just us alone. And 36% of them didn't even involve us taking them to the hospital. This is like a really stark contrast to a lot of the programs that are police officers with mental health practitioners in the cop car with them. Most of those teams, whether it's the one in, let's say, Watsonville or in LA County with the sheriffs, most of those end up, about 50% of them end up on a forced hold, where they do a 5150, and it's an involuntary hold at the hospital. As you can see here, not even 50% of the calls that we do end up going to the hospital, let alone being forced into an involuntary hold. So one of the things that we really focus on is trying to prevent people from having involuntary holds put on them, and prevent police interactions with people who are feeling suicidal. So additionally, we also work, because we have EMTs, we also have sort of, we work with the fire department and the EMS system. And we prevent a lot, you know, one of the other things we take a lot of pride in is keeping people out of the emergency rooms that don't need to be in the emergency rooms. And so in 2017, we had about 3,000 ER diversions. We estimate in our local Medicaid CCO, we save them about $4 million per year. And we save the hospital system over $10 million per year. And so that's a really good, you know, reason to think about doing a mobile crisis in your city, because that money can be used for other things to create equity. So in thinking about this, Eugene Springfield population is about 210,000. It's a little bit smaller than the entirety of Santa Cruz County, which is, I think, is about 270,000. Springfield, the city where we operate in Eugene, we also operate in Springfield. So Eugene's a sort of big city, I-5 goes here, and then Springfield's a little city just kind of connected to it. Springfield is about the same size as Santa Cruz. And we did about 6,500 calls there in 2019. In Eugene and Springfield combined, we did just under 30,000. And that was with, you know, that 30,000 is with 2 24-hour units and a 7-hour unit. And less than 1% of those required some kind of police to respond to us because of a safety issue. We aren't trained in restraining people. We don't go hands-on with people. We don't do any of those kinds of things. So if somebody attacks us, which happens from time to time, then the police are the ones that are responsible for managing that. So here's a little bit of a price comparison. Oh, I forgot to put that number in there, but the Santa Cruz Police Department costs about $2.14 million for every 10 full-time employees. My estimate is that I think that if you did mobile crisis and you fully funded it pretty well, it would cost you about $1.25 million per 10 full-time employees. And it might cost a little bit more in Santa Cruz just because Santa Cruz is crazy expensive. But you know, in an urban area like Los Angeles or you know, even parts of the Bay, I think it would cost you about $1.25 million for 10 full-time employees. Then that's supposed to say SCPD there, my apologies. SCPD costs about $300 per response. So every time you call the police, it costs about $300 for them to come out and check on you. Surprisingly, that's less money than LAPD, which costs over $1,000 every time that they respond. Mobile crisis, I think if you go off the Eugene numbers and you go off the funding that I sort of estimate, it would cost you around $100 per response. So in Santa Cruz, it'd be about 1/3 the cost for every response, which is very important to note because in Santa Cruz, I don't know if, I'm sure everyone living there is quite aware. You have a population of people living on the street that is unlike any other city, probably in the country. 2% of your city's population is living on the street. Their point in time count has about 2% of the city living unhoused. 60% of all responses by the Santa Cruz Police Department is for people who are living on the street. That is 60,000 calls a year, 60,000 responses per year, and which comes out to be almost 7 per hour. So in the time that we're going to talk here, this hour and a half, the Santa Cruz Police Department will respond 10 times to somebody living on the street. And so that's a pretty significant number. One of the things that we do, obviously, at Cahoots is we respond to people living on the street, and we do so in a much more supportive service way. So we provide them with food, with supplies, and things of that nature. If we were to take, let's say we were to take a majority, if you had a mobile crisis team in Santa Cruz and they took a majority of the police calls that are going for people living on the street, let's just say something to the tune of 50,000, then you could respond to those 50,000 calls with, my guesstimate is about 4 mobile crisis units. So $6 million. That's 1/5, 20% of with 20% of the budget, you could respond to 50% of the police calls for your unhoused population. You know, then we have to ask the question, okay, what is the you know, what could that other savings be used for? Maybe just getting people off the street, housing them. You'd save a ton of money and be much more humanistic, much more compassionate approach to how things work. You're gonna give, I don't know if you've given me a time yet, but oh, there's the bear cat here in Santa Cruz. So I'm gonna do one little comparison here. Oh, I hope it's on here. Yeah. So this is a really good example of a different model, the crisis response model that is the primary model that goes on in our country, which is putting a crisis worker of some sort, a social worker or something, in a cop car with a police officer. So this is from West Hollywood, where the sheriffs had a sheriff respond to a man who was recently evicted, 65 years old, and the sheriff responds, calls the mental evaluation team, which is similar to the care team in Watsonville, who sends out 2 people, a sheriff and a social worker, who then call the fire department, who sends out a fire truck and an ambulance. So we've got 8 people here dealing with this one 65-year-old guy. If a sergeant shows up or a captain shows up, we're talking 10 people. If another officer shows up, 11 for just this one fellow. The MET team does the evaluation of him mentally. The fire department does the evaluation of him physically, and what they determine is that he needs to go to the hospital. And all in all, this costs $3,750 for what it is. And this poor guy had to be, you know, dealing with a huge group of folks out on the street, which must have been very overwhelming for him. And the reality is that a mobile crisis team could have handled this entire call all on their own. They could have, because they could have had the first response that would have been done just by them, the mental evaluation done by the crisis counselor, the physical evaluation done by the EMT, and the transport to the hospital completed by the team. And as you saw earlier, it would have cost $100. So so this is we think that this is, our model is a phenomenal model for how cities should be rethinking public safety and rethinking how you know, cities give responses to people who are really just situations that are overwhelming, that they don't know how to handle. They need connections to resources. They need somebody to just listen to them. They need somebody to sit with them and just be like, you know what, it's messed up, you know, stuff sucks and it's really hard, and we understand, you know, that things are not easy, and you're doing the best you can, and we believe in you, that you can get through this, and whatever support we can give you, that's what we're going to give, and that's what we do. That's our whole model. That's how we respond to things. And I just want to sort of finish up with something I wrote down, and then I'll be out of here if I can find it. So I think that that what we're thinking about in this listening to Dr. Jones is hearing her talk about defunding, and I really love that. And then she also made this great point, which is that we have to rebuild. And I think that as we're all thinking about this, we're actually somewhat doing both of them at the same time. And so let's rebuild together. And I hope that you guys feel galvanized by this to figure out how to rebuild public safety in Santa Cruz.
Thank you so much, Ben Adam. Really, really appreciate that. There's been so much interest in really understanding and unpacking the mechanics of the Kahoot system. And we're so grateful for this explanation, but also for the way that you've really linked that to our community here in Santa Cruz. So that was really enlightening. Thank you. I just want to remind everyone that we are recording this presentation. So if there are particular references or data points that you didn't catch, we are going to make the recording available afterwards so you can go back and listen to it again. And if you have questions that come up, you're welcome to put them in the chat. Just looking at time, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, but again, we'll try to get to as many as we can. And now I will hand it over to our last panelist, Kayla Kumar.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. This has been incredible to be in the audience until now. You two, thank you so much for your work and all that you bring to this work. Thank you again to everyone who organized the event and everybody who showed up today. I just want to give you props for being curious and diving deeper into this topic. It's one that's very dear to my heart. I've been working in this field here in Santa Cruz County for the better part of a decade. But really, before I get there, I want to share one of my entry points to this work, what brings me to it, and that is lived experience. I was a system-impacted youth. Growing up, I left home at a super young age. I was 15. And of course, that involved a lot of, or it kind of introduced a lot of instability, unpredictability in my life. And part of navigating that, for me, involved a lot of mistakes. A lot of behavioral mistakes that were criminalized. And, you know, for folks like me, young people like me that don't have that really solid kind of network of support, when we get in trouble with the criminal justice system, we don't have that to lean back on. And the impact of these systems just seems so much greater. And so that's really, I bring to the work that understanding firsthand of the impact of these systems, but also the impact of community. You know, every time that I got in a tough spot, or, you know, I was acting out or working through trauma in a way that wasn't serving me or others, there was always somebody in my community that showed up for me and tried to get me what I need, that, you know, and tried to get me on the right track. And for no other reason, really no reason, you know, they're not related to me or anything like that. It wasn't their job. It was just community. So that also brings me to this work, is I've also experienced the curative nature of community-based ways of doing things. And then the last thing is around the way that I have encountered what is possible, how to create safety here in Santa Cruz. And of course, the example that I'm most familiar with is Santa Cruz Barrios Unidos, which is the first place that I worked when I moved here to Santa Cruz. And one of the major operating principles of Barrios Unidos, there's many, it's hard to coalesce them all down, but one that really calls to me is something called restorative justice. And so in the kind of status quo way that we approach justice, what we do is we look at a set of laws and we say, you broke this one and this one and this one. And now we're going to correct your behavior through these series of punishments. And what restorative justice calls us to do instead is to say, what is the harm? What harm was done? And what community resources do we have at our disposal to remedy that harm? And who's responsible for that process? Barrios Unidos carries that work out here locally. One other part of what Barrios Unidos does here that that also kind of informs my approach as well is around culture and is around race. And it's around how these aspects of identity are very important to understanding the world, understanding yourself, being well, feeling in your power, and that these kind of concepts actually can help us create safety if we kind of reclaim them, right, through a community process. And so, you know, that work, as the kind introduction that you gave, Camila, it took me from anything restorative justice circles in state prisons to our local juvenile hall, talking about re-entering the community after being incarcerated in the juvenile hall for an extended period of time. What does that mean for a young person who's like right in that really important part of their development? To the probation diversion centers and holding sessions there about for youth that are on supervision or various other aspects of the system. And then of course, now I am a commissioner on the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Commission. So I've had a chance to kind of see how the system operates throughout all the different parts, right? From policing to incarceration to supervision. To this kind of oversight. And I really share that to say that when I say that I believe a better way is possible, it's having really worked in these systems and seen them up close. And I do believe that we can do better and that we have what it takes to do better right here in Santa Cruz. And so what I can add from the incredible presentations that already happened today is perhaps to try to localize some of these the way that these systems play out and localize some of the ways that we can move forward. So the first thing I want to do with you is kind of describe the way that criminal justice systems impact Santa Cruz County. And I think if I can leave you all with the most, if one thing you take away from what I say here today, it's that here in Santa Cruz County, criminal justice system has an acute impact at the intersection of race, class, neurological diversity, otherwise known as mental health, and gender expression and sexual orientation. This is the intersection that I see time and time again, the focus of the system seems to be placed in a disproportionate way. So I just want to echo what's already been said. I won't go into it again, but how important it is that our approach is intersectional, that understands that there's multiple interwoven identities that we need to be holding space for in the solutions that we create, but it also must be explicitly anti-racist in Santa Cruz County. So I think from here, I'm going to share a few stats that I've learned along the way to help ground us in kind of the numbers, so to speak. So the first is around policing. And according to the California Sentencing Institute, Santa Cruz County has been in the top 10 of this entire state for the arrest rates of Latinx youth for the last 10 years. So this is out of the last 10 years, we're consistently top 10, and actually about 5 of those years, we're actually in the top 5. And so I bring this up to say that this is a prolonged issue that has been happening in this county, I'm sure much longer than that, but this is just the data that is currently at my disposal. And I also just want to share too, when we think about Santa Cruz, is we're like the rating that we have right now is just blowing places like Los Angeles County just completely out of the water. we are much higher than places like Los Angeles County. So race and policing, the intersection of those two things is profound here in Santa Cruz. I also want to share that according to Santa Cruz homeless census, 28% of unhoused people in Santa Cruz spent at least one night in jail in 2019. And that's been the case again for a number of years. So these are issues that have been around. They are not just arising, and they seem to stick regardless of the ways in which the population kind of ebbs and flows. I also want to share and give a nod to my friend. She's a UCSC researcher, Roxy Davis, who's been doing some work around our court system. Hey. And in her work, she found that Black people are overrepresented in our adult criminal courts by at least 3.5 times of their proportion of the population. And this is also, an issue in the sense there is a racial disparity impact. White people in Santa Cruz County are about a 1-to-1 ratio in the way that they're represented in the court system. So it seems to be disproportionately focused on Black community members in our local court system. I also want to share that in the same work that Roxy is carrying out, there's 23% of those cases in the court system were around people who are experiencing homelessness. And as Ben Adam pointed out, we do have a significant, uniquely large population that is experiencing homelessness, and still 2% versus 23% being represented in our court cases is tenfold overrepresentation in our criminal justice system. In terms of incarceration and here in Santa Cruz County, again, the number of Latinx youth who have been detained in our local juvenile hall is at the 70% range, right? So over the last, and I've heard that this has gone back for since the 1980s. Some elders in the work have told me this has been the number since I started doing this work. 70% of the young people in our juvenile hall are Latinx, and of course, countywide, our demographics are about 30 to 35%. So that's about twice as overrepresented. These are really significant overrepresentations. These are not flukes. They've been going on for a really long time. And while our current probation system does not collect the sexual orientation or gender expression information of young people when they enter the system, there is research from our mutual friend, Angela Irvine out of Series Policy Research, which found that half of the girls who are in juvenile justice in detention are LGBT and gender nonconforming youth, girls. And so again, I mean, it's I just pulled out a few, and these are deeply troubling to me as a commissioner, as a community member, as someone that knows what it's like, right, to be going through these systems. I want to kind of move from here and talk about where this really the rubber meets the road for me is around stories, and around the stories that I hear through my work working with young people in the community and from the commission. But the story that I want to share with you all today and kind of center in this discussion about how we move forward is the story of Luke Smith, who is a 15-year-old boy here in Santa Cruz County in South County, and he was killed by law enforcement in 2016. It's not long ago. And for those who don't know, what happened in Luke's case was that he was experimenting with LSD, and the batch was a bad one. As a result, he had a mental health crisis. And in that crisis, he stabbed his father and his uncle with a folding knife. And thankfully, the father and the uncle survived. And both called 911 because, of course, this situation, it was absolutely overwhelming and outside of what, his family knew how to deal with, right? So they called for help. And law enforcement found Luke a little bit later, a few hours later. He was walking on a desolate road. He still had the folding knife, and law enforcement was able to kind of use some tactics to corner him against a fence. where he couldn't retreat or anything like that. And, their first attempts at diffusing the situation include tasing him, shooting, a type of non-lethal, I think, foam bullet. They deployed a canine on Luke to try to get him to drop the knife, and Luke didn't. So they shot him with a rifle. And still at that point, Luke had not dropped the knife. And so they tased him again. And still not having dropped the knife, they deployed the canine on him again while he's laying shot on the ground. At that point, he finally dropped the knife, and police handcuffed him. And then they provided life-saving services to Luke, but Luke died on the scene. And so that situation really, really impacted our community. I think so many of us were heartbroken by it. And the piece of that story that really, really calls to me and is so important has to do with when Luke's dad called 911. And one of the first things out of Mr. Smith's mouth was, "Please don't kill him, he's my son." And to me, that speaks to the moment we're in that this father wanted help for his son. And the current way that we have the system set up is you can have help for situations that are overwhelming, but you have to be willing to take on the risk that your child is going to die, especially if your child is one of color or doesn't conform, right? And so this is the roll of the dice that I hear from members in the community we are not willing to roll anymore. When we call for help, we want actual choices of services, of meeting our need, right? And so from here, that's kind of where I think it's a good example, right, of how we talk about what's next. How do we make it so that when we call 911, we do have those options. We do have options to address situations that are overwhelming, but don't require us to roll that dice. And so from that place, we have this critical discussion about how we use public resources, again, in this restorative justice, transformational justice model. How do we use public resources in ways that make sure that we have these options available to de-escalate overwhelming situations, to meet the needs that are being requested by our community? But I think first, what we do is we ask this fundamental question that underlies all this entire undertaking to me, and that is, what is safety, and who is allowed to feel and be safe in our community, and what does it mean for it to be normalized to have safety that is accessible by all people? And so for me, working in the spaces that I have learned of the many things that I've learned from the people who have come before me and have been working really hard for a lot longer than I have. I've learned that safety is not the absence of conflict, and it is not the absence of discomfort. It is our ability to create containers, right, for conflict, community ways of managing it that are life-affirming. And furthermore, safety, I think in Santa Cruz especially, a definition that I would find useful is safety as people getting their needs met: psychological needs, emotional needs, physical needs, economic needs. And that's, I think there's so much to unpack there, but I think part of undertaking this great work is really renegotiating our understanding of what safety is, and what creates safety and who creates safety. And so, of course, from the work that I've done here locally, there's a lot of that work going on. I think the question, the next question that we have to ask is, what is specifically being asked from the community when they call 911? and like what is it that we can really offer each other when we call and say, I don't know what to do, right? And so for me, like Ben Adam, I believe you said this, is like really looking at the calls and seeing like what are people just literally asking for. So there's a report done on SCPD. It was presented in 2018. And what this report revealed was that 15.5% of the calls made to the police on average on a daily basis were officially designated as crimes. And other categories that were up there included mental health support, folks that were struggling with substance abuse, and of course the impacts of homelessness on our local community. And so we know already from the calls that about 15.5% are actually crime related, and the rest could be better served, could very well be better served by models such as the one that you've presented here today, Ben Adam and Cahoots. Or, you know, moving from here, the models that currently exist in Santa Cruz. I know working firsthand in our community that there are places that are working hard and have been creating safety for a long time, again, because they meet people's needs. If we're using this definition of safety is created when people's needs are met, we do have these models. This is not completely recreating the wheel. We do live in a world where safety is created in other ways that don't involve policing. And this is true in Santa Cruz. I think one thing that I've learned about what makes these organizations or these programs specifically impactful to me has to do with a research project, a national research project I was a part of. And this project set out to answer this very question, like, what is the model that makes it so that we can tackle some of these social issues in such a high impact way? And just a few of those things that I've come to really believe and see the work of and see how strong it is having organizational leadership that represents and has the lived experience of those people that they serve, right? And I think this operates again on racial lines, on class lines, on gender expression and social and sexual orientation lines, but having your organization reflect the lived experience of those you're serving. I think another key piece is to have organizations that are able to understand and hold the complexity of the vision and agency of the people that they're serving, right? I think folks that are surviving systemic oppression, systemic racism, young people that are able to make it through the juvenile justice system alive are incredibly resilient, brilliant people, right? They have a lot to give. They have a lot of lessons to share with us. How are we creating community approaches that harness that resilience and that brilliance? And then the last thing I just want to kind of circle back on, and I shared that a little bit earlier, is about explicitly naming and reclaiming the greatness of being a person of color, of having culture, of not necessarily conforming to white middle class culture here in Santa Cruz, and having those kind of culturally rooted community healing models. And I think of the Ofrenda downtown at the clock tower, specifically around the death of Tamario Smith here locally in Santa Cruz, as an example of the way that we use cultural approaches to engage in community level healing. So again, this is happening. This is happening in Santa Cruz. And then of course, on top of this foundation of organizations, of community fabric that it is creating safety by meeting people's needs and holding the complexity of human life, we also do absolutely need to be talking about layering on MCIS or a Cahoots type crisis response approach that specifically is addressing that huge number of calls that are related to people experiencing homelessness. And I'm just blown away by those numbers. And I think letting that speak for itself and continue to drive us to that community solution will be the key. And the last thing I'll kind of wrap up here with is to point out again that locally there are efforts undergoing, like right now, that have already happened, that are leading us to this new world. And ones that come to mind is the recent decision by the Pajaro Valley United School District out in South County to reallocate their SRO budget line to social emotional counselors. I thought that decision was really powerful, and the community fought hard for that. It was very much from the young people organizing in South County and their adult allies that I think drove that through. The recent grand jury report released not long ago, which called for non-police responses to people experiencing situations that arise because we have such an unmitigated, really just the prevalence of homelessness in Santa Cruz County. And this specifically asked us to reallocate funds to services that meet the specific needs of this group. And then I think the last thing that I want to pull out for you all is Santa Cruz is also a nationally acclaimed example of decarceration for youth in our local county. It's called the JDAI program. And basically what that is an instrument that demands that youth who have not been convicted of non-serious, youth who have been convicted of non-serious crimes should not be incarcerated. We should not be putting children in cages. And this particular instrument is operated inside of our probation department. And that's why we do have fairly low levels of youth incarceration in our county, which is actually strange because we have such a high arrest rate of Latinx youth. So there's some tensions and gaps for sure that I see from my vantage point as a commissioner. But for there, I'll just leave it. I'm really excited to hear from folks out there in the audience, and I just want to wrap it up to say that again, I'm just so inspired by everyone who's finding a way to connect to this work. I want you to know that it is possible here in Santa Cruz County to do better, and so I look forward to figuring out how we can do that together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla. And now we'll move into the Q&A section. So what I've tried to do, because at one point there were maybe 20 questions in the chat. So what I've tried to do is sort of organize them into 4 broad thematic areas. So I'll try to kind of smush together different questions so we can try to get through as much as possible. And so what I ask is, when I ask a question, any of you can feel free to jump in. I think if we can spend Josh, is it okay if we go a couple minutes over, do you think? Yes, okay. So I think that, if we try to maybe spend about 5 minutes on each question, I know it's not enough time, but we can do our best. And so I think, the first set of questions, I think actually kind of dovetails really nicely with a lot of things that you had said, Kayla, but also connects to things that Ben Adam and Dr. Jones had said as well. And that's maybe how we need to start thinking about safety very differently, right? And understanding, safety, disentangling safety or harm and crime. And so, I guess my question really broadly is in a kind of a more broadly abolitionist framework, how are we actually understanding safety differently? And I think this relates to some of the questions that were even in the chat around, how we think about gang violence in schools and SROs, and if this reimagining of safety maybe also changes the way that we look at the question of gangs in public schools. Anyone can feel free to jump in on that one. How do we reimagine safety?
As to not waste any seconds that we have, I'll just jump in. And I'll say, on the question of safety, one of the things that I think about is what does safety mean from a young person who's a frequent target of policing, right? So I have had one student who told me that he grew up with the hands of the police down his pants because they're searching him every day, and they're not just going in his pockets, and they're not just stopping and frisking him, but they are doing intrusive searches on the street. Another student who told me about being shot by peers in gun violence and having the police threaten him as he thinks that he may be dying on the street, and they are threatening him, trying to coerce him into providing some information as he's fighting for his life. The routine kinds of experiences that young people have with the police, knowing that the police are always there and the violence persists, right? And so they are no safer from peer violence or violence at the hands of the police. And so I asked myself, and I was moved by Kayla's point, which she said about having people stand with her from the community. In the work that I've done, I've noticed when I stand with the young person who's a target, the world changes for them. The way the institutions respond to them, the way that people understand them, it kind of messes up the mechanisms of the system. It makes it like the gears can't move in the same way. And so what is a safe world from their perspective? If you ask that question, the role of the police diminishes because the police aren't delivering safety. Safety from that perspective is the same thing that it may mean for people who live in other settings that aren't high surveillance neighborhoods. So it's optimal well-being, it's economic stability, it's freedom from violence in the home, which we know is connected to economic stability and other kinds of trauma that passes along across generations. So I think what I would invite people to think about in that term, and people who are coming to the conversation of defunding, is what happens when you shift. When you shift from the maybe the urge to protect the police to stand with young people, to stand with Kayla when she was a kid, right? To stand with other young people who are their frequent targets, and then ask what keeps them safe. And then you have a whole different institutional landscape available to you.
Yeah, I think just you said something that really made me think about something that I didn't bring up, which is we should all sort of accept that cities and municipalities and stuff create responses to people who are having difficulty. That makes sense, and that you would send someone out to assist people in their moment of need. The question is, how do you do that in a trauma-informed way? And one of the things that people always ask us about Cahoots is, well, how come they basically ask us, how come you guys don't get murdered constantly? Because you don't carry weapons around with you. They basically ask that question. How do you stay safe? How is it possible that you could possibly stay safe on calls? And no one on Cahoots has ever been injured in 31 years. No one's ever stabbed one of us, shot one of us. I mean, I've been kicked and I've been spat on and whatnot, sure, whatever, it comes with the territory. But no one's ever been injured, no one's been able to not work because someone wounded them on a call. And the reason for that is because when you are cornered by people who have power over you, especially when you're somebody who's been through a lot of traumatic experiences, the very normal response is to attack. It's to lash out. And so when you have a whole system that's sort of centered around cornering you and subduing you, of course, most people's responses is to lash out. But when you have a system like Cahoots, where they're not there to corner you. They're not there to subdue you. They're there to listen to you and hear you and support you and give you things. I mean, we literally give people stuff, like food, which they need apparently to live. Then they don't want to kick us. They don't want to stab us. They don't want to do those types of things. And that's why we're safe, because we have this sort of trauma-informed approach to things, which goes a really long way in keeping us and them safe and establishing safety for the community as well.
Yeah, and if I can, I'll try to be quick. I want to take on the specific use of the word gang and the racial implications of that word, particularly here in Santa Cruz, but share it from the stories that I've heard from young people who, again, when we're talking about many of the young people who are finding community through what is known as a gang, they're doing so because they don't have the stability that perhaps some of their counterparts do have. And so I don't think anyone who's doing this work is like, oh, we're just like cool with gangs. We're actually trying to build other safe spaces for youth to work through what they're going through and feel seen and feel supported, that are alternatives to that as well. And so, I mean, I think that one habit that I see folks engaging in is when we talk about this new world where we're creating sustainable, life-affirming, cost-effective safety. What I hear folks sometimes want to gravitate to is like, but what about gangs, and what about these like really extreme but like very small number of instances, right, in our community where this activity is taking place. And I think that we can create systems that are addressing that don't take away from the fact that, here locally, they're about 85% of the work that police are currently doing can be done with other models, right, that are actually meeting specific needs. So I just call people in, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk more deeply about the use of fear of gangs and the way that we think through these issues. There are ways to work through it.
Thank you so much, all of you. And I appreciate Kayla really kind of encouraging us to question the language around gangs, especially because the sort of mediatized, manipulated fear of the most extreme examples of gang violence has been used to justify the increase of police budgets, increased forms of surveillance, and militarization of police. So I think that's also a really important intervention. The next set of questions, I think, relates to this. So, we've spent a lot of time sort of talking about the importance of having unarmed people trained in public health and social services to respond to nonviolent social welfare calls. And that seems to be very, very common sense, especially in the way that you've all laid it out. And there was a question in the comments about sort of more broadly how we can think about the possibilities of law enforcement without guns. And when I've had, conversations with community members about disarming or demilitarizing police, one of the points of pushback that I often get is, maybe you can disarm or demilitarize police in countries where gun ownership is not so widespread, but in the United States, that's not realistic. And especially in our community, where there was a sheriff's deputy who was apparently killed by someone who identified with the Boogaloo movement, that's created, I think, increased skepticism about the practicality of disarming or demilitarizing police. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about, again, how can we imagine law, if we're still in a world where law enforcement exists in some way, can we at least begin to imagine a disarmed law enforcement system?
Yeah, I'll jump in first because I think especially I feel still just so much grief and pain for the loss of Damon, who is the sheriff deputy who was killed here in Santa Cruz County. And so I want to say that when we're doing this work, and this work is specifically leading us towards a world where we don't need policing because there is safety created in these more life-affirming ways, that world does include Damon alive. And it's because we have dismantled the white supremacist system that the person who killed Damon was being animated by when he was committing this violence. And so to me, this work, if we're dismantling racism, if we are doing this in an explicitly anti-racist way that is making it infeasible to have white supremacy taking up so much space in our culture, then Damon is alive today. And so that's where I focus on in that particular question. Perhaps the other panelists would like to take on the other pieces.
This is a tough question, Professor Hawthorne, and whoever added it to the Q&A. I'm trying to think about how to respond in the time we have. One thing I'll say, I'll go back to the protests following the horrific killing of George Floyd. And you had police officers who were kneeling with protesters. And we saw the arbitrary, unwarranted, unrestrained acts of violence from other police officers. And people were, would say, well, isn't it great that there are officers who are kneeling, right, with the protesters, who are, have some kind of community. And it's almost as if, we believe, or people believe, that you can have policing that is one or the other. What has been fundamental to policing since it has existed in what is now the United States is the centrality of violence, from the third degree, right, to what we have today, from aggressive police encounters. And so if we get rid of that centrality of violence, if we get rid of the sanctioning of state violence, it's not policing, right? And so that's what makes the conversation. So it is in fact something else. And so why don't we just invest in something else and limit the potential of officers to use violence? So of course I think there are definitely places where officers can be unarmed. I definitely think there's, demilitarization is a must for a number of reasons. But I don't want us to kind of go down a path that ultimately will not get us where we actually want to go, right? Which is investing in these other resources that can better address and undo the kind of racist roots of policing and the economic exploitation and the origins of policing.
Yeah, I think, in the economic exploitation roots too, in terms of the original police charter that ever existed in the world, right, was created to enforce contracts and sort of monitor property laws and things like that. It didn't deal with things like murder and rape and like violent assaults. Like that was not anything part of that at all. And so of course the macabre reality of that it was initially created to enforce contracts and property is that at that time people stolen from Africa were property, and so that's where you get this, and it evolves into slave patrols and on and on and on. And so what we're sort of dealing with in this sort of situation is that the vast bulk of what is done by policing, which is sort of enforcing what we might call sort of what I heard very glibly called the other day is quality of life crimes or violations, which is to be without money in a capitalist society. It is their sort of primary thing. That's what they do most of the time, and on very rare occasion are they sort of managing sort of violence or even extreme violence. And so it's the violence and the extreme violence is used as this sort of like, haha, gotcha, kind of a thing. And it's like, look, we can talk about how we're going to handle violence and extreme violence as a society when we get to that point when the people that we have tasked with that are not also doing all this other stuff that is really problematic, for folks and is not really creating safety. So when we get to that point, then we'll talk about what to do about that other stuff, but for now, I mean, let's try to at least figure out this other thing first,
Thank you so much for those answers. And then there's a whole host of other questions that are specifically about cahoots, but more generally about what it means to reinvest in social services. And so, there's one set of questions about, it's a step in the right direction, right, to invest in, divest from kind of armed police responding to particular kinds of calls and reinvest in, trained first responders who are trained in public health and social services. But at the same time, we have to understand that social services in the United States also have a history of being tied to very racist formations of, surveillance and social policing. So how do we also at the same time work to transform our support services toward being anti-racist alongside our efforts to defund police? And I think a related question that also came up in the chat is that, Cahoots still has a connection to the Eugene Police Department, but the APTP does not. And so can we talk about the pros and cons of these different models and what it means for Cahoots to still have that connection to the police department?
Let's go to the bigger one first. That was the first question. I don't have an answer to that. But.
So I want to make sure that I'm understanding. I don't mean to answer a different question. if I am in the kind of bigger one, but working in kind of the nonprofit community fabric of Santa Cruz County, I do believe that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the way that we're being anti-racist in our approaches. Again, I think it's has to do with some of the points that I listed out in my presentation about the way that we're making space for folks who are impacted by systems, formerly incarcerated people, people of color, people who have been negatively impacted by the criminal justice system in general, are having have the ability to be in leadership positions, decision-making positions in organizations or programs that we're setting forward to meet some of these community needs. I do think in taking funds from the aspects of policing that we have talked about a few times already that don't seem like, you know, that it's better carried out from nonprofit organizations or community-based approaches, taking that money from the police budget and investing it into those services. I can tell you, if we're not working 13 hours a day on crumbs trying to serve our people, that if we have more support and are better funded and are able to kind of like, support staff in these nonprofits with livable wages, with benefits, and also be able to bring in the knowledge and education and training there about how to do anti-racist work. I think the results of that type of training, of that type of education, will be far more fruitful than, say, having a 3-hour-long training on, equity at a law enforcement agency. So that would be my response to that question. It has to do with resources again, right? Of like who can actually invest and deepen their work and make sure that that deepening is explicitly anti-racist. We do need to invest in that deepening.
Are we done?
If anyone else would like to jump in, I think this is going to be our last question just because we're so pressed on time. But if anyone else would like to, either Dr. Jones or Ben Adam, if you'd like to jump into this question, both about how we ensure that the social services that we are investing in are not reproducing racist logics, and also this question about, creating these systems and whether or not they should still have a connection to police departments.
I want to hear Ben Adams' response.
Oh, on what part? On what part? On connecting?
How you negotiate the relationship with the police. One of the things that's really interesting is that you see, or Cruz seem to have a kind of space of legitimacy that either the police ceded over or agreed to work in. And so I'm curious as how you came to do that, and whether or not that's something that can be replicated. And
so our relationship, our relationship with the police is a good one, albeit a tenuous one, just for all the sort of obvious reasons. One is that we're working on less than 2% of their budget, but we're taking between 17 and 20% of their calls. So they know that what we're doing is extremely useful to them. They really like that, and they really like us around. I mean, they don't really like talking to suicidal teenagers all that much. They really don't like checking on people in the middle of the night who are sleeping outside. It's not their favorite things to do, so it's really nice for them to be able to call for us and to come out and handle those types of things. They hate talking to family members who are screaming at each other. That's just not their cup of tea. That's what I would do that all day. So there's that. And then at the same time, there's the obvious sort of conflict, which is that we can take a lot of their calls, and there's a concern of like, well, what happens when they start taking more and more and more, and we start to lose funding and so on. So there is that sort of tenuous relationship there constantly of perhaps we're infringing a little bit on their turf. But at the same time, they have to live with us because we're a source of city pride. I mean, Eugene thinks that Cahoots is the best freaking thing on the planet. And Eugene loves all their little like, oh, we're Eugene and we like, you know, we have country fair and we have, you know, Ken Kesey and all that kind of stuff. You know, they love all and Nike was founded here. You know, it's like they love that stuff. They love everything about that's like unique about their city. So Cahoots is one of those things. So, you know, there's no way it's ever going away. So obviously the relationship is and starting it in another city is of course going to be fraught with tension. And so that I think that's part of why it's always been when we've tried to replicate in places like Denver, it's always started very small, with very, you know, very, very small and very limited.
Well, thank you. Unless anyone else wants to jump in. I think yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much. This was an incredibly enriching discussion. I'm so grateful that we were able to take questions from the community. I have learned so much, and I know that everyone else has. So again, we're really, really grateful for your time. Thank you to everyone. I know we went about 10 minutes over, but I hope that this conversation was as edifying for all of you as it definitely was for me. And thanks to Josh, who's behind the scenes, behind that black box there as well. So I'm actually going to be, along with some other members of the community, jumping onto another call with a smaller call with Ben Adam now to actually start thinking about the logistics of how we might begin to think about implementing a Cahoots-like program here in Santa Cruz. So Ben, thank you so much for sticking around. Kayla and Dr. Jones, so wonderful to have you here. Thank you all for your questions. And this event has been recorded, so we will be able to share a recording at a future date. Thank you all so much.